Our notice about your violations in writing." She practically ran out of the room, her heels clicking rapidly on the tile floor as I walked home. Pieces started falling into place in my mind. Mrs. Chen's bench fine, the missing board members, the mysterious reorganization of documents. Karen wasn't just being difficult about my cat, there was something bigger going on here, and as the person who wrote these bylaws, I was probably the only one who could figure out exactly what it was. I looked down at my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number for Bob, our usually quiet treasurer. Maybe it was time to have a friendly chat about those missing financial reports. After all, if Karen wanted to play by the rules, we should make sure we were looking at all of them. Little did she know she just picked a fight with the one person who knew every single word of those bylaws by heart, and I had a feeling those pink flamingos were just the tip of the iceberg. My hands were shaking as I spread out all the HOA violation notices across my dining room table. Something wasn't adding up, and I knew it. That morning I'd run into Mrs. Chen crying on her front porch, clutching a similar notice to mine. Her crime, the beautiful hand-carved memorial bench her grandchildren had given her to remember their grandfather. Karen had called it an unauthorized structure. I started making calls to other neighbors, and the pattern became clear. Every single homeowner who'd gotten a violation notice in the past 3 months lived alone or was elder, not one of Karen's friends, or their families had received any fines despite their obvious violations. The Andersons had a bright purple front door that Karen's friend Susan had called charming at the last meeting. Even though our bylaws clearly stated all external paint colors needed approval, my lawyer instincts kicked in. I pulled out my laptop and started documenting everything: photos of Karen's friends' violations, the Williams' unauthorized above-ground pool, the Peterson's commercial vehicles parked in their driveway, and yes, those ridiculous flamingos that seemed to multiply every week. Then I mapped out all the fines issued since Karen took over. The pattern was so obvious it made my stomach turn. Walking around the neighborhood with my camera, I noticed something even stranger. Karen's recent landscaping improvement project had actually extended her backyard by about 3 feet into the community green space. I remembered handling the property surveys years ago. When I wrote the bylaws that night, I dug through my old files in the basement and found what I needed: the original property maps. But what really got me was finding little Tommy from next door hiding behind my garage. He was afraid to play basketball in his own driveway because Karen had threatened his parents with fines, saying the hoop was an eyesore. Meanwhile, her own grandkids had a whole playground set up in their backyard that definitely exceeded our height restrictions. I made a trip to City Hall to check public records. Turns out Karen had never even submitted the required paperwork for her recent home additions. That's when I discovered something that made my jaw drop. Her position as HOA president might not even be legitimate, according to state laws about board elections. The next day my doorbell rang. It was Robert, our retired former maintenance supervisor. "I've been waiting for someone to start asking questions," he said, pulling out a thick folder from his bag. I kept copies of everything inside were maintenance requests Karen had denied without board approval, emails showing her directing contracts to her brother's company, and photos of property damage she'd blamed on innocent homeowners. Just as I was organizing all this evidence, my security camera caught Susan sneaking up to my porch. She didn't leave a notice this time. Instead, she was taking pictures of my front door, the same door that had been approved by the previous board 5 years ago. I smiled, knowing I just caught her in the act of harassment that evening, watching Whiskers curl up in his favorite window spot. I realized this wasn't just about my cat anymore. Karen hadn't just picked a fight with me, she'd picked a fight with every decent homeowner in our community, and she had no idea she was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the true purpose of those bylaws I had written. But first I needed to make one more call to my old friend at the local newspaper. After all, nothing scares an HOA bully more than public exposure, and I had a feeling tomorrow's board meeting was going to be very interesting indeed. At first I thought I was alone in this fight, but then Mrs. Chen knocked on my door at 7 a.m. with a box of old HO letters. Her hands were shaking as she showed me 5 years' worth of unfair fines, each one signed by Karen with that same smug signature. While we looked through the papers, 3 more neighbors came by with similar stories. That's when I knew this was bigger than just my cat. I started holding quiet meetings in my garage every Tuesday night. First, it was just 5 of us sharing stories over coffee and cookies. By the 3rd week, 15 residents packed in between my parked car and the storage boxes. Each person brought another piece to the puzzle: photos of Karen's friends violating rules without consequences, copies of sudden fee increases that never went through proper channels, even videos of her yelling at kids for playing hopscotch on their own driveways. Bob, our treasurer, who usually just nodded along at meetings, surprised everyone by slipping me a USB drive. After church, I've been keeping track, he whispered, looking over his shoulder. The numbers don't add up. He was right. The spreadsheets showed thousands in miscellaneous maintenance fees that never turned into actual maintenance. Meanwhile, the community pool had been closed for 3 months because we couldn't afford a new filter. The former board president, Jim, now living in Florida, became my secret weapon. After I Emailed him about the situation. He spent a whole weekend digging through his garage for old documents. What he found was gold: the original meeting minutes from when I wrote the bylaws proving that Karen had been making up rules that didn't exist. Even better, he had recordings of board meetings where she'd voted for the very things she was now finding people for. My dining room turned into something like a detective's office from those TV shows. I had maps of the neighborhood marked with red pins showing every violation Karen ignored for her friends, and green pins for all the unfair fines she'd given to everyone else. The pattern was so obvious it looked like Christmas decorations gone wrong. Sarah from the local newspaper, whose daughter had been fed for having the wrong color basketball hoops, started asking questions about our HOA's financial records. Funny how Karen suddenly had a scheduling conflict when asked for an interview. Even funnier was watching her speed walk away from the mailbox when she saw Momi coming with my camera documenting how her own yard didn't meet the standards she was enforcing on everyone else. The real breakthrough came when Lisa, who works at the county clerk's office, discovered that Karen had never properly filed some required HOA paperwork. She'd been so busy writing up fines she'd forgotten to maintain the HOA's legal standing. I couldn't help but smile. Have you ever wondered what happens when a power-hungry HOA president messes with the wrong homeowner? After getting slapped with ridiculous fines over my beloved cat, I decided to remind everyone exactly who wrote the HOA bylaws they were so eager to abuse. And let's just say karma has a way of coming back with extra sharp claws. Welcome to my channel. Please subscribe if you want more Karen and HOA stories. My hands were shaking as I read the bright red notice taped to my front door. $500, that's how much the HOA wanted me to pay for having an unauthorized exotic pet. I looked down at Whiskers, my perfectly normal orange tabby cat, who was rubbing against my legs like he did every evening when I got home from work. He was about as exotic as a peanut butter sandwich. I had just finished a long day at the law firm when I found this ridiculous notice. The date on it showed it had been put up this morning, probably right after I left for work. That's when I noticed something else that made my blood boil. Karen Thompson's signature at the bottom with a new title: HOA Board President. Karen had moved into our neighborhood just 6 months ago, but she'd already made herself famous for all the wrong reasons. She complained about Mr. Rodriguez's wind chimes being too ethnic, reported Mrs. Chen's memorial garden as decreasing property values, and now this nonsense about my cat. The funny thing, I'd lived in Oakwood Heights for 15 years. 10 of those years I'd served as the HOA's legal counsel. I literally wrote every single one of those bylaws they were now trying to use against me, but Karen didn't know that she'd never bothered to check the records or even introduce herself properly. I grabbed my phone and took pictures of the notice, then carefully removed it from my door. Through my front window, I could see Karen watching from her porch across the street, pretending to water her illegal pink flamingo garden decorations. Yes, illegal. Section 7.3 of the bylaws specifically addressed lawn ornaments, a rule I'd actually written to be flexible for reasonable homeowners, but right now those flamingos were the least of my concerns. Inside my house, I found another copy of the notice had been slipped under my door along with a thick packet of violation documentation. I spread everything out on my kitchen table while Whiskers jumped up to investigate. The evidence included blurry photos of my cat sitting in my window, a highlighted copy of the pet regulations, and this made me laugh out loud. A printed WebMD article about exotic pet diseases. My phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor Tom Baker. Did you get one too? I was about to reply when I heard loud voices outside through my kitchen window. I watched Karen leading her friend Susan Barnes' door to do, thick stack of papers in hand. They stopped at Mrs. Chen's house, and I felt my stomach twist. The elderly widow was still grieving her husband, and the last thing she needed was more harassment about her memorial garden. I was considering going outside to intervene when my doorbell rang. It was Bob Miller, our neighborhood treasurer for the past 8 years. His usually cheerful face looked worried. Listen, he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. You need to know what happened at today's emergency board meeting. Karen pushed through a bunch of new enforcement procedures. She's targeting at least 6 other homeowners with fines. She's calling it her neighborhood improvement initiative. I invited Bob inside, and as he shared more details, I started taking notes. Karen had somehow convinced the board to give her direct enforcement authority, a clear violation of Section 3.2 of the bylaws. She'd also appointed Susan as her enforcement deputy, a position that didn't even exist in our HOA structure. As Bob left, I walked him to the door just in time to see Karen marching up Mrs. Chen's driveway with a new notice. Through the evening air, I could hear the older woman's distressed voice. But this bench, it's all I have left of him. That was it. I'd written those bylaws to protect our community, not to bully people. I went to my home office and pulled out my old HOA files. If Karen wanted to play with rules, she was about to learn an important lesson about messing with the person who wrote them. I looked at Whiskers, now curled up on my desk calendar. What do you say, buddy? Ready to help me teach them about karma? He blinked slowly and purred, which I took as a yes. I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning of what would become The biggest HOA showdown our quiet suburb had ever seen. I walked into the HOA meeting room with my folder of documents ready to calmly discuss the ridiculous fine, but Karen was already there, perched at the head of the table like a queen on her throne, tapping her hot pink acrylic nails on the wooden surface. The sight of her condescending smile made my stomach turn. Good evening, everyone," I said politely, taking my seat. That's when I noticed something odd. Half the usual board members were missing. Instead, there sat Karen's weekly tennis partners Susan and Linda, who'd never shown interest in HOA matters before. Karen cleared her throat dramatically. "Let's address the violation regarding your unauthorized exotic animal." She emphasized each word like she was speaking to a child. "As I've documented here, your pet clearly violates Section 8 of our bylaws." I had to bite back a laugh. "My cat Whiskers is a regular domestic short hair. I've lived here for 15 years, and he's been with me for 7 of them." I pulled out my veterinary records. "I have all his documentation right here." But Karen wasn't even looking at my papers. She was too busy admiring her own French manicure. "Rules are rules," she declared, while Susan and Linda nodded in perfect sync. "The fine stands, and if the animal isn't removed within 30 days, additional penalties will apply." That's when something caught my eye through the window: a cluster of bright pink flamingos dotting Karen's front lawn, identical to the ones in Susan's and Linda's yards. I remembered writing Section 7.3 of the bylaws specifically about lawn ornaments, making it flexible enough for reasonable decorations, but strict enough to prevent excessive displays. "Speaking of rules," I said carefully, "I couldn't help but notice the matching lawn decorations at your properties. Perhaps we should review the ornament guidelines as well." Karen's face flushed red. "Those are limited edition collector's items, not common decorations. They're completely different." She shuffled her papers nervously. "Besides, we're here about your pet violation, not my artistic choices." As I looked around the room, I started noticing other things too. The meeting minutes folder was suspiciously thin. The financial reports that usually sat in the corner were nowhere to be seen. And wasn't there supposed to be a public notice period before changing board membership? "I'd like to request copies of the last 6 months of meeting minutes," I said, keeping my voice level. "And while we're at it, I'd love to see the documentation of the board member changes just to ensure we're following all proper procedures." Karen's I twitched slightly. "Those are being reorganized for efficiency purposes." She quickly changed the subject. "Now about your cat situation. We've had complaints about it disturbing the peace." "Really?" I pulled out my phone because I have here an email from our previous board president specifically approving Whiskers' residence. "Would you like to see it?" The room got very quiet. Even Susan and Linda stopped their synchronized nodding. "This meeting is adjourned," Karen announced abruptly, gathering her papers. "You'll receive further All those years I spent making sure every I was dotted and T was crossed while writing these bylaws were about to pay off. As our evidence pile grew, so did our confidence. People stopped paying Karen's ridiculous fines. Kids started playing outside again. Mrs. Chen put up wind chimes, and for the first time in months their gentle tinkling wasn't met with an immediate violation notice. We were ready for the next board meeting where Karen would learn that karma doesn't just knock, sometimes it brings the whole neighborhood with it. The community center buzzed with tension as I walked in carrying my thick binder of evidence. Karen sat at the head table wearing her usual smug smile and designer blazer, completely unaware of what was coming. The room was packed. I'd never seen so many neighbors at a board meeting before. Even Mr. Jenkins, who hadn't left his house since his hip surgery, had somehow made it. I noticed Karen's smile falter slightly when she saw my confident walk to the podium. Her friend Susan whispered something in her ear, but Karen just waved her off. Big mistake. Before we discuss the ridiculous fine about my cat, I began, my voice steady and clear. I'd like to address some concerning patterns I've discovered. I pulled out the first document from my binder, a property map of our community. Funny how every single fine issued in the past 6 months has been given to homes marked in red on this map. Karen's face twitched. Those are simply the violations we found. Interesting, I cut in, because these red marks perfectly match the homes of people who voted against your election last year. The room erupted in whispers. I wasn't done. And speaking of violations, let's talk about Article 2 Section 14 of our bylaws. Karen's face went pale. She knew exactly what that section was. I'd written it specifically to prevent abuse of power. The projection screen behind me lit up with archived photos of her house, your unapproved pool installation last summer, the commercial vehicle parking violations, and oh yes, those lovely pink flamingos that somehow got a special exemption. Susan jumped up, her voice shrill. This is harassment. I calmly pulled out another document. Actually, Susan, according to the legal definition of harassment, which I've highlighted here from Section 8.2, a clause I also wrote, this is called documented evidence of bylaw violations. Would you like me to continue with the photos of your unauthorized fence extension? The room was dead silent now. I could see Bob, our treasurer, trying to hide a smile. Karen's hands were shaking as she shuffled through her papers, desperately looking for something to counter with. But the real issue isn't just the selective enforcement, I continued pulling out Mrs. Chen's fine notice, it's the blatant disregard for our community's values. This fine was issued to Mrs. Chen for a memorial bench, a bench that falls well within the acceptable guidelines I specifically included in Section 57 about memorial structures. Mrs. Chen, sitting in the front row, wiped away a tear as several neighbors patted her shoulder. Karen's face had turned from pale to bright red. I saved the best for last. And now about my cat Whiskers, the so-called exotic pet that triggered this investigation. I pulled out the original HOA pet clause, displaying it on the screen. I wrote this section myself 10 years ago, specifically including language to protect reasonable pet ownership. Would anyone like to guess who approved it? That's right, our former board president, who sent me this notarized statement confirming it. The room erupted in a mix of laughter and angry muttering. Karen finally stood up, her voice trembling with rage. This is all circumstantial. You can't actually. Bob interrupted, standing up with his own folder. I have the financial records showing unauthorized administrative fees that weren't approved by the board. Should we discuss those too? Karen looked around the room, suddenly realizing she was cornered. Her face twisted into an ugly scowl as she gathered her things. This isn't over. I'll sue every single one of you. I couldn't help but smile. Section 128. Karen, frivolous legal threats against board members carry a $1,000 fine. Would you like me to add that to your tab? The room fell dead silent as I opened my laptop and connected it to the projector. Karen's smirk started to fade when the first slide appeared, a side-by-side comparison of her house's unapproved bright purple trim with the exact bylaw she'd used to fine 3 other homeowners for their non-standard paint colors. Let's start with something simple, I said, keeping my voice steady. Section 4.2, which I wrote during the great paint color debate of 2010. I clicked through photos showing each of Karen's friends' violations next to the fines she'd given others for the same things. Susan shifted uncomfortably in her seat when her 3-foot garden gnome called Tyan appeared on screen. Bob, our treasurer, stood up next. I've got something to add, he said, pulling out a stack of papers. These are bank statements showing unusual administrative fees being charged to specific homeowners, all of whom have filed complaints against board members in the past year. The room erupted in whispers. Karen jumped to her feet, her face turning as purple as a house trim. This is a witch hunt. You can't prove anything. She grabbed her designer purse, nearly knocking over her water bottle. I'll sue every single one of you. I calmly held up my hand before you make threats. Karen, you might want to review section. I pulled up the relevant page. I added this clause specifically to protect homeowners from retaliatory legal action. Any board member making unfounded legal threats faces immediate removal and a fine equal to the legal fees they're threatening to cause. Mrs. Chen, who had been quietly watching from her seat, slowly stood up. Her voice shook slightly, but her words were clear. When my Henry died, I just wanted a small bench to remember him by. You told me it was against the rules and fined me $1,000. She pulled out a wrinkled paper, but I found this old newsletter from when you approved your friend's whole backyard memorial fountain. More neighbors started speaking up. The family with the unauthorized basketball hoop shared photos of Karen's own yard full of unpermitted playground equipment. The college student who'd been fined for parking his unsightly work truck showed documentation of Karen's son regularly parking his broken-down RV on the street. Karen's face went from purple to white as the evidence mounted. She tried interrupting, but each time I simply pulled up another bylaw, each one I'd written showing exactly how she'd broken it. When she realized half the room was recording everything on their phones, she made one last attempt. This is all hearsay. I demand to see the original bylaws. She thought she had me there. Most HOAs lose track of their original documents. Lucky for us, I'd kept every single version with detailed notes. I projected my final slide, a scanned copy of the original bylaws with my signature and notary stamp. Article 7 Section 3. No board members shall selectively enforce these bylaws for personal gain or vendetta. I smiled. I added that after our last power-hungry president tried something similar, the vote was unanimous. Karen was removed from the board along with Susan and 2 other members who'd helped her scheme the new board's first act, approving Mrs. Chen's bench, complete with a small garden around it that the neighbors helped plant the very next weekend. As for my cat Whiskers, he got his own special amendment in the bylaws. All felines should be considered pre-approved residents, as they ultimately do whatever they want anyway. I framed his honorary HOA inspector certificate and hung it right next to my law degree. The best part came 3 weeks later when Karen tried selling her house to escape the embarrassment. Turns out that purple trim she'd painted without approval according to the bylaws she'd been so fond of quoting, she had to repaint it before any sale could be approved. The new color, a lovely shade called Karma Gray,